morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm really glad you're here today, and I am excited to spend this time with you today. So, my hope is that you leave here with at least one insight, maybe one question, or one perspective that helps you understand yourself a little better and your relationships a little differently. Because if we can increase awareness, we increase our ability to make different choices. So, before we get started, I'd like to begin with a simple grounding exercise. I'd like for everybody to take a slow breath in and slow breath out. And please notice where this lands in your chest or belly. All right? And now take a look around wherever you are and identify three things you know are true right now. So, no assumptions, no predictions, just facts. Maybe you're sitting in a chair. Maybe you're listening to this live. Maybe you're holding a cup of coffee. Just notice three things you know for certain. So I love this exercise because so much of our stress, anxiety, and relationship pain comes from what happens when we move beyond the facts and start filling in the blanks. And that is exactly what I'm going to talk about today. So before we jump in, I'd like for everybody to tell me where they're from. Uh, just type in the chat where you're joining from. I'd love to see where everyone is tuning in from. And okay. So a few weeks ago, well, not a few, last week, I did my first live discussion here on Facebook. Unfortunately, there were some technical issues. I couldn't see the comments. I couldn't even see if anybody was watching. And it was so confusing to me. I wasn't even sure that the live was recording. So I just sat there talking. But my inner critic started getting louder. And maybe you know that voice too. The voice that shows up when there's uncertainty and immediately starts trying to explain what's happening. Mine started saying things like, well, you just need to stop this. Nobody's interested. Nobody wants to hear what I have to say. And just wrap it up and go about your day. So, the interesting thing that I noticed was that I had absolutely no evidence of any of those things being true. I didn't have enough information, but my mind didn't like the uncertainty. So it created a story. And the more I reflected on the experience, the more I realized how often we do the same thing in our relationships. So when somebody doesn't text back, or somebody seems distant, or plans change, before we know it, we've assigned meaning to the situation. We're no longer responding to what happened. We're responding to what we think it means. And that's the lesson that I took away from that experience. I learned that day that fear fills in the blanks. When we don't have enough information, fear is often more than willing to provide the rest. And that's why I want to give you a simple framework that we'll come back to throughout the conversation today. So whenever you feel activated, overwhelmed, just ask yourself, what am I making this mean? And then after, what do I actually know? Because awareness creates choice, and choice creates freedom. And that's the same process that shows up in our relationships every single day. When somebody doesn't text back, what am I making this mean? When somebody needs space, what am I making this mean? If plans change, oh my gosh, what am I making this mean? So the story we create often determines how we feel, how we respond, and what we do next. And that's why understanding attachment is so important. Because for many people, the patterns just don't just create frustration, they create shame. They create the feeling that everyone else seems to know how to do relationships except them. They create the belief that if they could just stop overthinking, stop worrying, stop needing reassurance, stop getting triggered, or stop pulling away, that everything could finally fall into place. But over time, those experiences can create a deeper story. A story that says, something is wrong with me. I am too much. I'm not enough. Maybe I'm the problem. And for some people, that story becomes so ingrained that they begin to feel flawed to their core. And I know that feeling because I've lived it. For years, I wasn't just worried about relationships. I genuinely believed something was just very, very wrong with me. And every relationship struggle became evidence that I was flawed in some way. And I spent a lot of time believing my worth was something I had to earn. I thought if I could be more successful, more helpful, more understanding, or even less emotional, that people would accept me and I would feel like I was enough. But what I've come to realize is that our worth isn't something we earn. Our worth is inherent. We are born with it. Relationships can reflect our worth, but they do not create our worth. Achievements can express our gifts, but they do not determine our value. And another person's ability to love us and care for us and show us affection does not determine who we are. What I didn't understand then was that I was not broken. I was only reacting from patterns that have developed for very understandable reasons from when I was a child. So the moment I stopped asking, what's wrong with me, and started asking, what is this pattern trying to protect, everything began to change. So there was a time in my life when I became so ashamed that I didn't want to be seen, as mentioned before. But what I've learned is that attachment patterns are not evidence that something is wrong with us. They are evidence that you adapted. They are evidence that your nervous system learned strategies to help you feel safe, connected, loved, and accepted. And while those strategies may no longer be serving you, that doesn't mean you're broken. It only means you're human. We developed those survival strategies as a child because that's our way that we felt safe, connected, loved, and accepted. And my hope is that by the end of today's conversation, you'll have a little more understanding of yourself and a little more compassion for your patterns and a little less judgment. Because when we understand something, we can change. So let me ask you a question. How many of you have overthought a text message? Waited anxiously for a response? Stayed in a relationship longer than you should have? Overgiven? Or even pulled away when somebody got too close? If you can relate to any of those, type a 1 in the chat. And that's me. And again, I have technical issues, so I can't see the chat. So I just want to let you know that if you did type a 1, you're not alone. And it's a common adaptation pattern. And that's why we're having this conversation. So now that we've talked about how fear fills in the blanks, let's talk about attachment. Because attachment is one of those words that gets used a lot, but many people don't fully understand what it means. When you hear the word attachment, what comes to mind? So you could drop a word in the chat for everybody else to see. Um, just so you can share your thoughts. But when I think about the word attachment, I think of things like relationships, anxiety, connection, trust, and abandonment. So while attachment affects all of those things, attachment itself is much simpler than most people think. Attachment is a survival strategy. It's a way we learn to seek safety. It's a way we learned to seek connection when we were growing up. And it's a way we learn to avoid the pain. So at its core, attachment is about trying to answer one question. How do I stay safe and connected? As children, we adapt to the environments we grow up in. We learn what gets us connection. We learn what creates distance. And we learn what feels safe. And we also learn what doesn't. So over time, those experiences shape how we relate to ourselves and other people. And one of the more important things that I want you to hear today is that your attachment style developed to protect you, and it is not your fault. I want to say that again. Your attachment style is developed to protect you, and it is not your fault. So let's look briefly at the 4 common attachment styles. And as I describe them, notice which one sounds most familiar for you. So anxious attachment tends to pursue connection. It moves towards people. Their nervous system seeks reassurance, closeness, and connection. And so if you've ever found yourself wanting more connection when a relationship feels uncertain, type a 1 in the chat. So avoidant attachment is the second type we're going to discuss, and their nervous system tends to create distance. Their nervous system wants to move away from people. It often prefers space, independence, and self-reliance. So if you've ever felt the need to pull back or create space when things become emotionally intense, type a 1 in the chat. So, and then the third type is disorganized attachment. Wants connection and fears it at the same time. Part of you wants that closeness, and then the other part wants that distance. It can feel like having one foot out the door and one foot wanting to stay in. If you've ever experienced both at the same time, type a 1 in the chat. So, and then the 4th type is secure attachment. Secure attachment stays connected to the self and others. It doesn't mean someone never feels fear, uncertainty, or discomfort. It simply means they can stay connected to themselves and the relationship when those feelings show up. And so if secure is something you're working towards, type a 1 in the chat. And I'm definitely working towards it. So notice something important. These attachment patterns are not identities. They are strategies. Different strategies for navigating relationships and connection. And once we understand the strategy, we can begin to understand what it's trying to accomplish. So, which brings me to another important question. If attachment is the strategy, what fear is the strategy trying to solve? So let's talk about the fear underneath the strategy. Because every attachment strategy is trying to solve a problem. Every behavior is trying to create safety for us. And when we understand the fear, the behavior starts to make sense. So let's start with anxious attachment. Those core fears are abandonment, rejection, and not being enough. So when connection feels uncertain, the anxious system tends to move towards people. Their nervous system seeks reassurance. It seeks the clarity, it seeks the connection. They're doing this because their nervous system is trying to create safety, not because they're needy. So with the anxious attachment, they're worried about being rejected, feared being abandoned, and often wonder if they're enough. So if you've ever wondered about those feelings, type a 1 in the chat. I do it regularly. So let's look at the avoidant attachment now. And those core fears are dependence, vulnerability, and losing freedom. When relationships become emotionally intense, the avoidance system often moves towards space. Distance feels safer than vulnerability. Independence feels safer than dependence. And because, again, this is their nervous system trying to create safety, it doesn't mean that somebody with an avoidant attachment is incapable of connection. However, they will often feel overwhelmed by closeness, needing space, or worried about losing their independence. If you have ever felt this, please type a 1 in the chat. And now, the third type, the disorganized attachment. Their core fears are abandonment and engulfment. For many people with disorganized attachment, both connection and distance feels unsafe. When somebody gets close, they feel scared. Parts of them want connection, but the other parts want protection. Parts of them want to move closer, but another parts wants to move away before they get hurt. So you can find them reaching out, seeking assurance, wanting the closeness, and then suddenly feeling overwhelmed, uncertain, or afraid. And then they lose the connection. Just finding reasons, miscellaneous reasons to keep people at a distance. And this push-pull dynamic can be exhausting for not just the other person receiving it, but also for the individual trying to maintain their feeling of safety. At one time, they're receiving 2 different messages. Come closer, yet stay back. They want love, but they don't want to get hurt. So they're often feeling stuck, confused, torn between what they want and what they're afraid of. So if you've ever been pulled in 2 different directions in a relationship, type a 1 in the chat. I've been there. I was fearful avoidant before I started the rapid reset method. And so now let's talk about the 4th type. Again, it's the secure attachment. And like I mentioned, secure people experience fear. They are not fear-free. They experience uncertainty, disappointment, and difficult emotions. But the difference is they're able to stay present, tolerate that uncertainty, and communicate their needs with calmness. So instead of immediately reacting, they can pause, reflect, and respond. And that's something all of us can learn, because secure attachment isn't perfection. It's just practicing. So, as you've been listening, what fear do you think shows up most often for you? Is it abandonment, rejection, not being enough, vulnerability, losing freedom, or something else? Please take a moment to think about it. You do not need to share that fear in the chat. Just notice it, because awareness is the first step. We can't change a pattern we do not recognize. But once we understand the fear, we can begin to understand the behavior. And once we begin to understand the behavior, we can begin to understand the pattern. And once we understand that pattern, we can start making different choices. So, I want to go to the next part of today's discussion. Because fear doesn't just create behaviors, fear creates stories. So, we've talked about attachment and those fears underneath our patterns. Let's talk about what happens next. Because fear doesn't just influence how we feel, fear influences how we interpret what happens around us. Remember the phrase when we first started, fear fills in the blanks? So when we don't have enough information, our minds naturally try to create meaning. The problem is that fear is often the one writing the story. So let me give you a few examples. When somebody doesn't reply to your text, to me, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what does this mean? But the event is they haven't replied. And the fear makes me think, oh, I bet you they're upset with me. I don't think they care about me. That's it. Oh, I bet you they're losing interest. Oh, I hope they're not rejecting me. So, has anyone else ever done that? And I'll give you another example. Someone changes the plans. That's the event. That's what we know. The only thing we know for certain is the plans changed. But when fear fills in the blanks, we often create a story around it. Maybe the story is, oh, they changed their plans because I'm not important, or they don't value me, or I must have done something wrong. So notice how quickly I moved from what happened to what I think it means. And if you've ever caught yourself creating a story before you had all the information, type a 1 in the chat. So this is where I want to introduce a concept called rejection sensitive dysphoria, or RSD. RSD is common in ADHD and many neurodivergent individuals. It doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you're broken. It means that experiences of rejection, criticism, or perceived disapproval can feel especially intense. And when RSD gets activated, neutral events can feel deeply personal. For example, that delayed text, the change of plans, a lack of response. None of those automatically mean rejection. But when my fear or RSD gets involved, my brain quickly jumps to that conclusion. So if you've ever assumed rejection before you had all the facts, type a 1 in the chat. And I also want to point out that this doesn't just happen in dating relationships. It happens at work too. It happens when my boss sends a short email or a coworker doesn't respond to one of my messages. Yeah, the event itself is often neutral, but fear quickly creates a story. Oh, my supervisor must be upset with me. Oh, I must have made this person mad. Uh-oh, I think I'm in trouble. My friends have all heard me call them multiple times about those scenarios. So just like in our relationship, we often react to what we think something means rather than what we actually know. Fear doesn't just fill in the blanks in our dating lives. Fear fills in the blanks everywhere. So that brings us back to one of the most important questions we can ask ourselves. What do I actually know? Not what am I assuming? What am I afraid of? What am I predicting? No, it's just what do I actually know? Because most suffering happens in that gap between what happened and what we think it means. That text message isn't the problem. The story is. The changed plans aren't the problem, it's the story. And once we become aware of the story, we have a choice. We can either continue to react to it or we can get curious about it. Because awareness creates choice and choice creates the freedom. But here's the challenge. When fear fills in the blanks, many of us don't stop at creating stories. We start doing things to regain certainty. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So when relationships feel uncertain, most people don't just sit there with the discomfort. The automatic response is to do something to try to feel safer. And those strategies often show up differently depending on our attachment patterns. For some people, fear says, move towards the connection. Both are trying to solve the same problem, safety. Let's start with the move towards strategy. So, with that, many people unconsciously believe if I give more, the connection will feel safer. So when fear shows up, they do more. They try harder. They give more, they explain more, they accommodate more, and they carry more. Not because they're weak, but because they're trying to create certainty. I've been there. I took the whole burden of relationships on my back at some time. And I realize now it was because I was trying to create safety. And when I was doing that, I was over explaining, over functioning. I said carrying the relationship mainly. And I was always seeking that reassurance. But while I was doing all of this overgiving, I was neglecting my personal needs. And so that's one of the biggest lessons I've learned in this is supporting a relationship and carrying a relationship are not the same thing. Supporting means both people are contributing, both people are investing, and both people are taking the responsibility. Carrying means one person is doing most of the work. One person is managing the emotions, and one person is trying to hold everything together. So here's the question I want you to think about. Am I supporting this relationship or am I carrying it? And if you've ever realized you were carrying more than your share, type a 1 in the chat. And now let's look at the move away strategy. For many people with avoidant tendencies, safety comes from distance. Instead of moving towards connection, when fear shows up, they move away from it. They withdraw, they shut down, they distract themselves, and they avoid those difficult conversations. And deep down, they're trying to convince themselves that they don't need anyone. So if you've ever told yourself, I'm fine, when you really weren't fine, type a 1 in the chat. Because just as overgiving can become a strategy for safety, distancing can become a strategy for safety. One strategy says if I stay connected, I'll be safe. The avoidant says if I stay independent, I'll be safe. Different strategy, same goal. But what both strategies have in common is they can lead to self-abandonment. One abandons themselves by focusing on everyone else's needs. The other abandons themselves by disconnecting from their own needs, feelings, and vulnerability. Either way, we lose connection with ourselves. And that's where boundaries become important. For many people, boundaries sound great in theory, but they're terrifying in practice. For me, they were terrifying because my fear starts talking. It was, what if they leave? What if they're upset when I put these boundaries in? Oh, they might reject me. And oh, if I put this boundary in, they might not want to be around me anymore. So if you've ever avoided setting a boundary because you were worried about how someone would react, type a one in the chat. Because here's what I've learned. Boundaries don't destroy healthy relationships. Boundaries create clarity, they help us communicate honestly, and they help us understand where I end and another person begins. And they help us build relationships based on reality rather than fear. Because ultimately, healthy relationships require two people who are willing to stay connected to themselves, not just each other. And that's why attachment work eventually becomes something much deeper. Because eventually the question stops being, will they choose me? And it becomes, will I choose myself? Because eventually all attachment work becomes self-trust work. So today we've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about attachment, fear, talked about the stories fear creates and the strategies we use to feel safe. But eventually all of this work leads to one place, self-trust. Because at some point, healing stops being about understanding your patterns and starts being about choosing something different. And one of the frameworks that's been most helpful for me is understanding the difference between the inner child and my future self. So before I go any further, your inner child is not bad. Your inner child is not the problem, but your inner child carries the fears, wounds, and unmet needs that developed over time. And when we're activated, that inner child asks questions like, am I safe? Am I loved? Am I wanted? And those are very human questions. The problem is that when we're highly activated, those questions can become the only thing we focus on. We become consumed with whether someone will stay, whether someone will text back, and whether they'll choose us. And that's where the future self comes in. The future self asks a different question. Instead of asking, am I safe? The future self asks, what choice creates the healthiest outcome? A very different question. Because it shifts our focus from trying to control someone else's choices to taking responsibility for our own. And that is what I call self-leadership. Self-leadership is the ability to stay connected to yourself when fear is asking you to abandon yourself, and the ability to honor your values when your emotions are running high. It's the ability to choose what is healthy rather than simply reacting to what felt urgent. And self-leadership doesn't mean you don't feel fear. It means fear is no longer making all of your decisions. So instead of asking, how do I make this discomfort go away? Self-leadership asks, what choice aligns with who I want to become? And that's where the lasting change begins. So when we're activated, there are a few questions I like to come back to. Can I stay present? Can I tolerate uncertainty? Can I honor what I know? And can I choose myself? Those are the questions that build self-trust. Because self-trust isn't built when everything is going well. Self-trust is built when things feel uncertain and we still show up for ourselves. So if you've ever stayed in a situation longer than you should have because you were hoping someone else would change, type a 1 in the chat. I've done it multiple times. And one of the biggest shifts in my own life happened when I stopped asking, will they choose me? And started asking, am I choosing myself? Not in a selfish way, but in a self-respecting way. Am I responding from fear or am I responding from self-trust? Sometimes choosing yourself looks like sending the honest text instead of staying silent. It also looks like taking 5 minutes of a pause before replying to emotionally heated text instead of reacting from activation. And it also can look like honoring a boundary, speaking up for a need, or accepting what is rather than trying to control the outcome. And that question changed everything. Because when we're focused on whether someone else chooses us, I was handing over my power to those people. I made my peace, my self-worth, and my well-being dependent on if the other person chose me. But when I started to ask, am I choosing myself? I came back to what mattered. I came back to my values, my boundaries, my needs, and my need for self-respect. And from that place, I made decisions that align from who I want to be rather than reacting from fear. So the goal of attachment work is not to become perfect. And it's not to stop caring about relationships. The goal is to become someone who can stay connected to themselves even when uncertainty shows up. Because secure attachment grows when self-trust grows. And the more you trust yourself to handle disappointment, rejection, uncertainty, and difficult emotions, the less you will need other people to make you feel safe. And that's where real freedom begins. So as I wrap up today, I want to come back to where we started. At the beginning of today's discussion, I shared a story about my first live. I couldn't see the comments. I didn't know if anyone was watching and wasn't even sure if the live was recording. I didn't have enough information, but my mind started creating those stories, and that's what fear does. Fear fills in the blanks. And as you've been listening today, you've probably realized that this doesn't just happen during live videos. It happens in relationships. It happens at work. It happens with your social situations. It's everywhere. Fear fills in the blanks. And before we know it, we're reacting to a story instead of responding to reality. So I hope you'll remember the framework we talked about today. What am I making this mean? And what do I actually know? Are the two questions you should ask yourself when an event triggers you. What am I making this mean? And what do I actually know? Because awareness creates choice, and choice creates freedom. And your attachment style is not your identity. We all move on a continuum on those attachment styles, being who you're with, because your nervous system craves that safety. It's a strategy. That strategy is developed to help you feel safe, connected, and accepted in that relationship. Your attachment style is developed to protect you, and it is not your fault. It just means you've adapted. And what I've learned is that healing isn't becoming someone else. It's about understanding yourself well enough to make different choices. Because when we understand our patterns, we stop asking, what's wrong with me? And we start asking, what is this pattern trying to protect? So if that shift resonates with you, type a 1 in the chat. And as I leave today, I want to give you 4 questions to carry with you. What am I making this mean? What do I actually know? What is the fear underneath this reaction? And what would my future self choose? Those 4 questions have the power to change the way you experience relationships. Because the goal isn't to become fear-free. The goal is to become self-trusting, to stay present when fear shows up, to tolerate that uncertainty, to honor what you know, to communicate your needs, and to choose yourself without abandoning others. Because secure attachment grows when self-trust grows. And self-trust grows every time you choose to stay connected to yourself and honor your needs. So if today's conversation resonated with you and you'd like more support understanding the patterns that continue to show up in your life, relationships, or even at work, I absolutely would love to help you. One of the challenges with personal growth is that it's often difficult to see our own blind spots. We can recognize what keeps happening, but not always understand why. Sometimes we need someone to help us connect the dots between our fears, attachment problems, beliefs, and strategies we've developed to feel safe. So if today's conversation helped you recognize yourself in some of those patterns, I have a free attachment guide that walks through the 4 attachment styles, the fear that drives them, and how these patterns can show up every day. Simply comment attachment and I'll send it to you. And if you'd like deeper support identifying the patterns that keep showing up in your relationships, send me a private message. I'd be happy to connect with you and explore whether coaching might be a good fit for you. And we can talk about the rapid reset method, what it's done for me, others, and what it could do for you. So before you go, I'd love to stay connected. If you're already not following my new business page, Dr. Jill Spectrum Coaching, I invite you to follow me there. Beginning next month, all of my coaching content will be shared exclusively through the Facebook site of Dr. Jill's Spectrum Coaching. And that's where you'll find resources, live trainings, educational content, nervous system regulation information, and information to help you create a lasting change in your life. So my goal is simple. It's to help people understand themselves more deeply, trust themselves more fully, and lead themselves more intentionally. Because healing doesn't happen in a single conversation. It happens one moment of awareness at a time, one new choice at a time, and one act of self-trust at a time. And if there's one final thought I'd love to leave you with, is that you are not broken. You may have fears, you may have wounds, you may have patterns that no longer serve you, but none, absolutely none of those things define your worth. They are simply part of your story. And the moment we stop treating your worth as something we have to earn and start recognizing it as something you already possess, everything begins to change. Because awareness creates choice, and choice creates freedom. Thank you for spending this time with me today. And it's truly an honor to have these conversations with you. And thank you for being willing to look honestly at these patterns that shape your relationship in your life. And most of all, thank you for being human with me today. Because every one of us is learning, every one of us is growing, and every one of us is navigating fear, uncertainty, connection, and change to be the best that we can be with the awareness that we have right now. So my hope is that you leave here with greater compassion for yourself, more curiosity about your patterns, and more confidence in your ability to make different choices moving forward. So I'd love to hear from you. What questions do you have? Just either message me on Facebook or down below in the chat. And before we finish, I want to give you a preview of next week's conversation. I kind of alluded to it. Today we talked about attachment, fear, self-trust, and the patterns that shape our relationship. Next week, I'm going to talk about boundaries and hopefully have a working chat. I'll look at why they're so difficult for many people, why guilt, fear, and people-pleasing often get in the way, how attachment patterns influence our ability to set and maintain boundaries, and how healthy boundaries can actually strengthen relationships rather than damage them. Because boundaries aren't about controlling other people. They're about staying connected to yourself. And I hope you'll join me next week. So I thank you for this time together. I wish you a great week.